After Eden Academy's first end-of-term gala, where Anya and Damien share their first dance, the story shifts its focus to Henry Henderson and Martha as they look back on their intertwined past. This arc takes us deep into their memories, revealing their experiences during the First East-West War, both on and off the battlefield. What kind of bond was forged through love and war, and how did it shape the people they've become today? Let's find out. The scene shifted to the morning after the end-of-term party. Professor Henderson greeted the dorm mother of Cecile Hall, whom he politely addressed as matron. She returned the greeting while busily hanging laundry. Henderson commented that it was a quiet and elegant morning, to which the dorm mother replied that it wasn't surprising since many students had gone home for the end-of-term break. She added that she appreciated having fewer clothes to wash this time. Then, with a teasing smile, she mentioned something she'd heard from a little bird, that he and his dance partner were quite the darling couple at last night's party. Henderson hadn't expected that remark. Remembering the dance with Martha, he explained that she was simply a dear old friend. He recalled first seeing Martha when he was in his 11th year. He had just begun the high school program at 17, while she was an 8th-year student. It was during a dormitory New Year's talent show. Because of her exceptional ballet skills, Martha had received a scholarship to transfer to Eden, where she was also assigned to Cecile Hall. As he reminisced, the memory showed a young Martha performing gracefully on stage, her movements refined and fluid. Without realizing it, Henry had started clapping loudly and exclaimed how elegant she was, shocking everyone in the room. That, he said, was the very first time he had ever uttered the word elegant. From the stage, Martha heard his applause clearly. As a transfer student, she had hardly been noticed before, but after that performance, she gained many friends. Henderson, on the other hand, lost his because of his outburst in the middle of the show. And that was how he earned the nickname Mr. Elegant. He poured tea into his cup and quietly enjoyed it alone, lost in thought. He recalled the words of his father, who was an educator, teaching him to always be a gentleman. A girl nearby noticed him and commented on the pleasant aroma of his tea. Startled, Henry looked up and immediately recognized her. It was the ballerina he had applauded. She, too, realized who he was and referred to him as the elegant clapper. She approached and asked if he was even allowed to drink tea there. Henry replied that it was a special privilege granted to imperial scholars, but only before classes began. Martha was impressed to learn that he was an imperial scholar and fell silent, which puzzled Henry. Lifting the teapot, he told her there was still one more cup left and offered to share it with her, asking if she'd like some. Delighted, Martha accepted, and as she took a sip, she remarked on how good it tasted. Henry wasn't surprised. Martha practiced ballet before morning classes, and soon she began joining him for tea every day. His once quiet, solitary mornings were now interrupted by the liveliest intruder, but he didn't dislike their time together. She often talked about how she was a big admirer of Johanna from the Marlov Ballet Company, while Henry would respond curtly, telling her to finish her tea quickly and get to practice. When she called him by his first name, Henry sternly reminded her never to address an upperclassman that way. The next morning, Martha rushed in, apologizing for being late. But Henry calmly replied that he wasn't waiting for her in the first place. One day, behind the Eden Academy building, several students cornered Henry and started bullying him. One of them said they'd had enough of his stuck-up attitude. Since graduation was near, they decided it was time to settle things with him, mockingly calling him Mr. Elegant. Henry was 19 then, in his final year of high school. As he wiped the blood from his face after being punched, he calmly said that every act of violence was worth 3 nitrous bolts each, plus another for smoking on school grounds. The dark-haired boy sneered and kneed him again, saying that was exactly why they all hated him. Another taunted that Henry thought he was so noble just because he was an imperial scholar. The dark-haired one grabbed him by the collar, demanding to know why. If he was so elite, he wouldn't fight back. Henry replied that resolving conflict through violence was the behavior of animals, and that a gentleman uses words to reach understanding. The boy smirked, saying he had just the kind of discourse Henry deserved. But before he could act, a girl suddenly leapt in from behind, spinning in the air before striking the boy with what she called her fouette kick, a ballet-style spinning leg strike. The bullies were caught off guard, and she immediately followed with an allonge chop, extending her body's line and swinging her arms gracefully yet powerfully across their faces. One of the boys with bangs rushed forward, grabbed her from behind, and told her to stop, shocking her for a moment. That was when Henry stepped in and struck him down himself, declaring that such behavior was not elegant. When his fist landed, Henry froze, horrified that he had resorted to animal behavior. The girl, however, brushed it off, saying humans were animals anyway. Henry pointed at her in disapproval, calling her a fool and demanding to know what Martha was thinking. She denied being Martha and dramatically introduced herself as the masked warrior ballerina, Lady M. Henry pulled the cloth off her face, revealing a shocked Martha Marriott, 16 years old and in her final year of middle school. Around them lay the defeated bullies. Still catching his breath, Henry asked what kind of madness this was. Martha explained that they were hurting him, so she stepped in. Henry scolded her, telling her never to use her art for such things, reminding her that her ballet competition was only a few days away and she needed to stay in top form. Martha smiled, saying she knew that, and promised not to fight using ballet again. Next time, she'd use a proper weapon instead, and thanked him for his concern. Henry was left speechless, wondering how she could act so much like a ruffian. She pointed out that he had thrown a punch himself. Henry froze, then suddenly ran off, shouting in distress that it had been an act of inelegance, something he couldn't forgive himself for. He rushed straight to the faculty room, flung the door open, and called out to his teacher. The man, calmly smoking indoors, simply remarked that running inside the building was prohibited and that Henry should know better. Henry immediately explained that Falco and his friends had attacked him and that he, in turn, had struck back. He requested to be punished with nitrous bolts for engaging in violence. The teacher looked at him in confusion and tried to calm him down, saying that Falco's family was a major munitions supplier for the military. Stirring up trouble with them, he warned, would only make things worse, so they would simply pretend nothing had happened. Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing and tried to argue, but the teacher pointed a finger at him and said that what truly concerned him was Henry's apparent boycott of his military training courses. If he continued that attitude, he'd earn a nitrous bolt for sedition. Henry was left speechless and stunned. As he left the room, he reflected that conflict between the East and West had existed for as long as he could remember. Later, while speaking with Martha, he wondered aloud how he could still call himself a gentleman after what had happened. He said he was far from deserving that title. Martha disagreed, saying he had acted like a true gentleman because he protected her. Those jerks wouldn't have listened no matter what he said, so how else could he have stopped them? She handed him her handkerchief to ease the swelling on his cheek and asked again, how would he stop such things? Henry said he already knew the answer, through education. Education, he explained, is what shapes people. It's the only way to end conflict, whether it's a simple brawl or a world war. Misunderstanding had been sown across the world, and as weapons multiplied, hatred deepened and poverty worsened. As they walked, Martha remarked that if he kept going on like that, he'd probably get punched again before finishing his lecture. Henry said brief conflicts like that didn't matter, but Martha told him he was trying too hard. Yet in his thoughts, Henry believed that society had neglected education and that even Eden's teachers had become corrupt. He vowed never to let that happen to him. From behind, Martha asked if he wanted to become a teacher, and he said yes. After graduation, he planned to enroll at Berlin University of Education. Martha was impressed, and Henry grew curious about her plans, asking if she intended to continue her ballet career. She admitted she wasn't sure yet, but planned to enter the high school ballet program the following year. Whether she could pursue ballet professionally would depend on her upcoming competition performance. And besides, she said, she didn't come from a wealthy family like him. Henry denied being wealthy, explaining that his family was nothing more than a deposed line of nobility clinging to the fading honor of a name that had mattered only in the imperial era. He gazed upward for a moment before feeling the sting of his bruised cheek again. Martha reminded him that she had already offered him something for that, and added that a true gentleman shouldn't be using foul language. The next day, the two met again at their usual spot for tea. But as soon as Martha took a sip, she coughed, saying the tea tasted bitter that day. Henry explained that the price of imported tea leaves had risen, and he could no longer afford the blend he usually used. so she would have to endure it. If their world continued down the path of war, he said, it would mean the end of their little tea parties. Martha was surprised to hear that, but after a pause, she took another sip and said she was already getting used to it. It actually tasted good, she added, though Henry found that hard to believe. He went on to tell her that his graduation was approaching. The right to hold tea parties like these would soon belong to her alone. He encouraged her to work hard, to become an imperial scholar herself, and to get permission from her instructor so she could continue the tradition with her friends. Martha fell silent at his words, quietly absorbing the weight of them. Gathering her courage, she then asked if he had plans to invite anyone to dance with him at their class graduation party. The question caught Henry off guard, calling it completely out of the blue. But Martha said she was simply curious. Henry brushed it off, saying as if he would ever take part in something so frivolous, especially at a time like that. Looking back now, he admitted that he had been incredibly naive then. He had become obsessed with chasing his ideals, desperate to change the world in a radical way. Because of that, he failed to keep up with the people around him, or even consider the hearts of those closest to him. He graduated and pursued the path he believed in, while Martha was left behind, alone. At present, at the BB Company building, Becky was completely shocked after hearing the story. She couldn't believe Martha had just let him leave without ever confessing her feelings. She even stood up and demanded to know what was wrong with her. While calmly sipping her tea, Martha said there was no need to be vulgar about it. She was still a child back then, and love had been such a distant concept to her. Even if she had felt something, she hadn't understood it or grasped what it truly meant. The next day, she still went to the garden, thinking Henry might be there. She had held on to an innocent belief that someone important would simply be waiting for her. Returning to the flashback, the dorm mother called out to Martha, addressing her as Miss Marriott. She reminded her that even if she didn't have ballet practice that day, it didn't mean she could just laze around, and told her to hurry up and get dressed. Martha, still half asleep at the table, could barely respond. The dorm mother grew curious and asked what had gotten into her lately, since she was usually an early bird. But Martha remained quiet and melancholic. Fast forward 2.5 years later, even the memory of Henry's graduation had started to fade, while the drums of war began to echo once again. Her tea had grown bitter once more. Leaving the dorm, the now 19-year-old Martha, in her 13th year, was still drowsy. A classmate called out to her, saying there was an assembly in the auditorium before class, surprising her. As the students gathered, they murmured among themselves, finding it hard to believe they only had half a year left before graduation. One asked another if she had figured out which university to attend, and the girl answered that she planned to enter Berlin University of Education. Another chimed in, asking if they'd heard that Mr. Jefferson from Rose Hall had gone on a business trip and died. Hearing Berlin University of Education, Martha paused in thought, realizing that Henry must be a senior there by now, unless he had to repeat a year. Soon, the announcement began. The speaker acknowledged that it was their final term, but mentioned that they had new faculty members to introduce. The first was Mr. Henry Henderson, who would be teaching history. Martha blushed the moment she saw him. Yet in the days that followed, the thundering of boots and the roar of tank engines slowly drowned out the beating of her heart. When the bell rang, Henry sat by the desk, listening to the radio. The OBC Daytime News announced that Parliament seemed poised to lower the minimum draft age by 2 years. Not long after, Martha visited him, shocked to see him there. She asked if he wasn't supposed to still be at the university, but Henry reminded her that she should never address a teacher by his first name. He explained that because of the war, there was now a shortage of personnel, and degree programs had been shortened by half a year. Martha hadn't expected that, saying that times were tough everywhere. The radio continued, proclaiming that the War of Unification would finally allow Austanians to wipe out the devil spawn of the West once and for all. Henry lowered the volume and then switched it off. He said that when the radio had first been introduced, he believed it would serve as a tool for education and enlightenment. But lately, all it broadcasted was inelegant filth meant only to stir anger and hatred among people. Martha laughed softly, saying he hadn't changed one bit. She was glad to see he was doing well, to which Henry replied in kind. Confused, she asked what he meant, and she pointed out that he hadn't even noticed the new cloak she was wearing. When he learned that she had become a scholar, his face lit up, and he congratulated her, saying well done. Martha blushed and nodded, adding that she had also kept his tea party tradition alive, though in truth, she rarely went there anymore. Hearing that, Henry's eyes brightened, and he invited her to join him for tea after class. Martha smiled and said she would steep a pot of her best blend. Together, they went straight to the garden and spent time talking endlessly, though it was mostly Martha who spoke. She shared how she had ranked high in the previous year's ballet competition and that a recruiter from the Marlov Ballet Company had even approached her afterward. Henry, on his part, vented about the frustration he felt when a physics professor had struck him. Because of that unexpected reunion, Martha found herself deeply happy, as if, for the briefest of moments, they had returned to the old days. The bell rang through the school, and Henry hurried his students to the shelter, telling them he would not allow them to waste time since it was only a drill. While they waited inside, the children whispered that a school in Turindia had been bombed, and one added that their dorm tutor had heard the boy's brother had died in the raid. Someone else mentioned rumors of human experimentation at the POW camps. Martha stood nearby and called to Henry, asking if, as a teacher, he was exempt from the draft. He answered that he was not exempt, only deferred for the moment, and wondered aloud how long that would hold. He paused, then said that even his relatives asked if he became a teacher just to avoid conscription, and he could not believe it. In an era of kill or be killed, what use was teaching history? They told him they would rather he taught physics so his work might at least produce a bomb. He finished by saying that it may be that even education felt powerless now, and the noise from outside continued. The next day, Martha's classmates rushed to show her a newspaper, telling her she needed to see the headline. Her eyes widened when she read that the Marlov Ballet had been caught in an air raid while performing to support war-torn Amber. 17 members of the troupe were killed, including the principal ballerina, Johanna. Shocked and devastated, Martha went straight to the garden, her heart heavy with grief for the dancer she had long admired. She sat silently at the table, head bowed, tears welling in her eyes. Before long, Henry arrived and was startled to find her there. When he saw her crying, Martha suddenly stood and ran toward him, overwhelmed, admitting that she no longer knew if there was anything left in her life that she could truly hold on to. Days later, Henry hurried to the garden again, calling her name in frustration. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know what she had done. His anger came from what he had heard from her homeroom teacher, that she had volunteered for the Women's Defense Auxiliary. Furious, he asked what on earth she was thinking. Martha told him to stop shouting, saying it was hardly gentlemanly to pound the table like that. Still, Henry could not contain his emotions. Martha explained that the ballet company was reportedly disbanding, a revelation that left him stunned. He grew deeply concerned seeing how broken she looked and realized that along with the company, her dream had also died. Yet he asked how joining the army could ever justify that. He pleaded with her not to give in to despair, warning that she could be killed. Martha answered calmly that women in the auxiliary were never sent close to the front lines. In truth, she had wanted to sign up for the officer training program, but women weren't allowed. Henry called it foolishness and demanded that she reconsider immediately. He couldn't believe she wanted to be part of what he called that senseless, bloody game known as war. Was she truly that naive? He asked. Martha, her voice shaking, commented about him and his precious ideals. He retorted that if she refused to fight back, then everything would be taken from her. She had already lost her dream, and one day, she might lose him too. If she didn't fight to protect what little she still had left, then she would lose everything for good. Henry shot back that he didn't remember himself asking her to protect him. He told her firmly to listen to him and withdraw from the auxiliary immediately. Tears filled Martha's eyes as she begged him to stop. As she turned to leave, she said bitterly that Henry was the fool because he didn't understand her at all. Frustrated and conflicted, Henry let her walk away and do as she wished. Henry admitted that back then, he had been the most stubborn idealist of all, still believing the world would change as long as it followed his principles. He had fought for something that, in truth, held no weight. At its core, he said, education was the act of influencing and inspiring others. Yet as he lectured, his students sat drowsy and disinterested, their eyes glazed with fatigue. Like a clown in a farce, the man who once spoke so passionately about the value of learning had failed to refute even one of Martha's arguments. It wasn't education that was powerless, it was him. Weeks passed, and the garden where they used to meet remained empty after their argument. The war continued to rage. The radio now aired calls for citizens to donate blood for the front lines. Inside Eden Academy, as classes ended, students gathered in small groups, complaining of hunger. Some discussed whether they had found dresses for the graduation party, though others doubted if a party would even happen. Rumors spread that students with poor grades would be sent to the infantry. As Martha walked alone through the hallway, she overheard voices coming from the faculty room. One teacher asked Henry if something was wrong, noting how grim he looked that day. Henry replied that his cousin had been killed in a naval battle near the Southern Islands. The other man expressed his sympathy, saying that if not for God's mercy, they too might have been lost, before putting out his cigarette. The conversation shifted when his colleague remarked that Henry, being the eldest son, should probably start looking for a wife. After all, no one knew when their turn might come to be sent to the front lines. Henry admitted that his parents had already begun pressuring him about marriage for that very reason. Martha, who was listening from the doorway, froze in shock. Her breath caught, and before she could stop herself, she ran off, unable to bear what she had heard. She fled to the courtyard and stood beneath a tree, struggling to process everything. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered repeatedly to herself that she no longer knew what to do or what she even wanted anymore. She didn't want to graduate like this. From behind, she overheard a boy calling out to someone named Shiona, asking if she wanted to dance together at the graduation party. The girl answered cheerfully that of course she would, and that they'd still be together even after graduation. Martha fell silent, recalling what Henry's colleague had said about not knowing when their turn would come to be sent to war. In that moment, her resolve hardened. She realized she could no longer simply assume Henry would always be there. The day of the graduation party finally came, and the students gathered in the grand hall, chatting cheerfully among themselves. Laughter filled the air until something suddenly caught everyone's attention. Even Henry turned to look. Standing at the entrance was Martha, wearing a uniform. Henry was stunned at the sight, asking why she was dressed like that, and she explained that she had only borrowed it for the ceremony. Then, summoning her courage, she asked him to dance with her. Henry froze for a moment, surprised by the request, but soon took her hand. The two moved into position and began to dance. Henry, however, struggled awkwardly with every step, clearly uncomfortable and stiff despite Martha's attempts to lead. She teased that he wasn't a very good dancer. Wasn't dancing supposed to be part of being a proper gentleman? Henry admitted that he simply wasn't very coordinated, that he had even taken lessons before but never got the hang of it. Martha laughed, calling it so inelegant, which made Henry blush as he protested that such words toward a faculty member were disrespectful. She only laughed again, saying it felt just like the old days. As they continued to dance, Martha's tone softened. She spoke seriously, and Henry paused, reflecting on her words. He apologized, admitting that she had been right all along. He said he had been the most inelegant of all, unable to respect her feelings, dismissing her ideals while stubbornly imposing his own. He realized now that behavior like that was one of the roots of war, and even he had been guilty of it. Martha smiled faintly, telling him he thought too much. Still, she said that very side of him was one of the things she liked most. Gripping his hand tighter, she said she had made up her mind. She would make sure he clearly understood her feelings before the dance ended. Blushing, Martha began to confess what she felt for him. But before she could finish, the warning bells suddenly rang out across the hall, cutting their moment short as chaos and alarm spread around them. Everyone began to panic, rushing toward the exits as teachers urged them to move faster. This time it wasn't a drill, they shouted. Some students were crying as they stumbled and shoved their way out. Amid the confusion, Henry released Martha's hand, startling her. He told her to compose herself. They had to move quickly. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Martha nodded and followed, both of them running with the crowd to reach safety. Moments later, it was announced that the alarm had been a false one. According to reports, an enemy aircraft had turned back before crossing into their airspace. The miscommunication had caused unnecessary panic among the watchmen. One of the students expressed his disappointment. A teacher scolded him, saying he should thank his lucky stars it was only a false alarm. calling him a fool for not realizing what would have happened if the enemy had gained control of the skies above their capital. As a precaution, the faculty decided to end the graduation party early. It was nearly finished anyway, and they believed the students had celebrated enough. Still, many were disappointed by the abrupt ending. Among them was Martha, her face still flushed from earlier. Henry approached her quietly and asked if she was all right. She stammered, saying she was fine, though her voice trembled. Remembering that she had tried to tell him something before the alarm, Henry asked what it was she wanted to say. Martha froze, unsure how to answer. After a moment's hesitation, she forced a smile and said it wasn't important. She had only wanted to receive his good wishes. She clarified that since they hadn't spoken much since their argument, she just wanted to part on good terms. Realizing she was right, Henry offered her a small smile and congratulated her, wishing her all the best in whatever came next. Martha thanked him, promising she would do her best. Yet deep inside, she had never despised her own hesitation more than she did in that very moment. When Martha returned to the dorm that night, she broke down in tears beside her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. The dorm mother, alarmed by the sound, hurried over and asked what was wrong, gently telling her to stop crying because she had brought something for her. She handed Martha a letter. It was from her uncle, written on the battlefield and addressed to his niece. Sitting beside her, the dorm mother wished that Miguel was doing well these days. But she mentioned that she could not bear the thought of seeing Martha in the same kind of danger he faced. Martha fell silent, gripping the paper tightly as an idea suddenly struck her. A letter, she whispered. That was the answer. She would write him a letter. Time passed, and as Martha continued her training with the Women's Defense Auxiliary, she began to write. Her pen hovered over the paper as she started with "My beloved Henry," but she immediately stopped, crumpled the sheet, and tossed it aside, realizing she couldn't possibly begin that way. From the top bunk, one of her fellow trainees curiously asked who she was writing to, but Martha quickly replied that it was none of her business and told her to go to sleep. Her hair was now cut short, a requirement of the auxiliary. That night, she finally composed her message. She wrote that their women's defense training had concluded, and the following week they would be deployed to the west. Their departure was scheduled for the 20th, an 8 a.m. train from Bautzen Station. She asked that if he had the time, she hoped he would come to see her off, because there was something she wanted to tell him. When the letter was sent, however, it was intercepted for inspection by a superior officer. The man frowned as he read it. Who in the world was she that she would include such sensitive details? Hadn't her training officer explained that revealing times and locations was strictly forbidden? He asked. He ordered the soldier to redact all confidential information from the letter before forwarding it. He could hardly believe what she had done. Spies were everywhere in those days, the officer said, and yet she had written her own itinerary as if it were nothing. The 20th finally arrived, the day Martha was to depart for the west. When she reached the station, her heart sank at the sight of the empty platform. Henry hadn't come. The realization filled her with quiet despair as she boarded the train. Meanwhile, in the northern region of Walls, the troops had successfully secured and fortified a base along the coastline. Back at Eden Academy, after class, someone approached Henry and informed him that he had received a letter. He thanked the messenger and was surprised to learn it was from Martha again. As he opened it, he hoped it wouldn't be redacted this time. The last one he'd gotten was so heavily censored that he could barely read a word. Her letter began with, "Dear Henry, how are you?" She explained she was writing from somewhere far from Berlin. In her last letter, she had accidentally included information that wasn't allowed, which had earned her a severe scolding from her commanding officer. That explained everything, Henry thought. Martha went on to ask if he had gotten used to teaching and whether the new school year was going well. Was he still hosting the tea parties, she wondered. She wrote that she couldn't share many details about her work, but that her duties were endless. Still, she remained in high spirits. It might be a long time before she could return, but she promised to keep writing to him so that neither of them would feel lonely. Henry couldn't help but mutter that she was rather presumptuous. Even so, he wrote back and made his way to the post office to send his reply. The clerk there told him that letters addressed to soldiers in the field could indeed be sent, accompanying supply shipments to their units. However, because of limited deliveries, they could not always guarantee fast correspondence. Henry thanked him for the help and handed over his letter. He began it with, To my dear student, Martha. Weeks later, at the camp where Martha was stationed, she could be seen hurrying excitedly across the grounds with a letter clutched in her hands. When a fellow trainee asked what it was, she answered that it was a reply from him. Her friend raised a brow and teased, asking if the sender was her lover. Henry's letter read, "I hope this finds you in good health. Whatever hardships you now face, remember to follow the regulations, for in many ways, adherence to rules is the measure of." But Martha stopped reading midway, realizing the entire letter was basically one long lecture. And worse, he had addressed her as his student. She let out a sigh, disheartened. Her comrade, watching her reaction, remarked that it sounded like a one-sided romance and urged her to be honest about her feelings. Martha smiled faintly, saying she would do her best, but asked if her friend could teach her how. And from that day on, she and Henry began exchanging letters regularly, keeping their connection alive through words carried across the war. In her next letter, Martha wrote about how her commanding officer had praised her performance. She wondered if earning enough star medals might make her an imperial soldier one day, asking if he understood what she meant. She admitted that she missed her old days at Eden Academy. Henry replied that he had recently been assigned to oversee the middle school students, and that their insolence constantly reminded him of her. They never seemed to stop giving him headaches. In another letter, Martha shared that a handsome man in her regiment had invited her to dinner and asked what she should do about it. In truth, it was a strategy her friend had suggested, hoping to make Henry jealous, but it didn't work. Henry simply answered that dining with colleagues was an important way to strengthen camaraderie and broaden one's perspective. For a time, their exchange of letters became a gentle substitute for their old tea parties. But as the war dragged on, Henry began receiving fewer and fewer letters. He even asked a colleague if there were any deliveries from Martha, but was told that nothing had arrived for over a month. As time passed, his hope of hearing from her turned into an ache of longing. One evening, during a social gathering, Henry overheard a group of officers talking nearby. One remarked that as the war went on, it was becoming harder to maintain morale at the front lines. Hearing that, Henry thought bitterly about how the military now dominated nearly all social matters. The officers continued, saying that even women had begun receiving primary combat training. Another officer tried to object, but his companion replied that all they needed was to buy enough time for the 6th Brigade to withdraw. If that message could be relayed successfully, it might help raise morale. The speaker ended by saying he would submit the plan for approval to high command. One of them begged that if they were to be deployed, let the Berlin News be the first to publish it, and Henry could not believe what he was hearing. Back with Martha, the Women's Defense Auxiliary was summoned to assemble in the courtyard. The commanding officer announced that given the current state of the war, the Ostanian People's Army was forming a new battalion of female fighters and urged any who were willing to serve on the front lines to volunteer, saying it would be a great honor to take such a post. He then told them to think carefully about the people they loved and what might happen to them, and that he expected their decisions that night. The women were stunned by the announcement. After dismissal, they could not accept that fighting on the front was even being considered for them. One of them said bluntly that they had not had serious combat training and refused. Another explained she had joined the auxiliary to protect the country, which made her think of her family and the captain's words. A different woman cut her off and insisted they forget it, calling the whole thing a cheap threat to coerce volunteers. What they called volunteering in name would be forced enlistment in practice. Someone else said no, but then admitted her boyfriend was the commanding officer and that deserters had been being executed left and right, so there would be nowhere to run. The others grew alarmed and began to cry, unable to accept the idea. If everyone refused, none of them could predict what would happen next. Then Martha spoke up and said she would fight, which shocked them. She reasoned that if they must die anyway, at least she could kill an enemy or maybe stop a bullet meant for the East. Despite the boldness of her words, worry showed on her face, and her comrades fell silent, thinking about what she had just said. News soon broke of the formation of a special women's military unit made up of volunteers from the Women's Defense Auxiliary. The report praised these brave and loyal women who fought side by side with the men on the front lines. Among the soldiers shown in the headline photograph was Martha. When Henry saw it, he froze in disbelief. His hands trembled as he stared at her image, unable to accept what he was reading. A student called out to him, reminding him that the debate competition was about to start. Snapping out of his daze, he apologized and hurried to the venue. The topic for the day's debate was whether humanity could ever truly be free from war. The first to argue the opposing position was a young boy named Donovan Desmond, who confidently stepped forward. He stated that they would never be free from war and that history itself was undeniable proof of that. Even if all weapons were purged from the world, he continued, it would change nothing because in the end, people were simply liars. He asked what would happen if other nations secretly kept their weapons, and as long as that suspicion existed, history was bound to repeat itself. Humanity would never truly know the intentions of others because each person hid their own. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Martha could be seen among her unit, carrying her weapon through the haze of smoke and fire. Back at the debate, Desmond added that of course he too desired peace, as anyone would, and he understood that resolving disputes through discussion instead of violence was the ideal path. But perhaps, he said, war itself was the best that mankind could manage. Even with wealth, government reform, and technological progress, the end of conflict remained unimaginable. The moderator thanked Desmond for sharing his views and called for the speaker of the affirmative side. But as the debate continued, Henry could no longer focus. The words of his students blurred together. His thoughts were elsewhere. His patience to listen to their earnest arguments had finally run out. After the debate, Henry was informed that a letter had arrived for him. The moment he heard it, he rushed over in desperation, startling the person who handed it to him. It was from Martha. In her letter, she asked if he was doing well, admitting that she herself was not. She wrote that she could barely eat lately, and that she had been having recurring nightmares. In those dreams, Henry was teaching at school, surrounded by children holding hands in a circle, yet she stood apart, crying, her hands covered in filth, unable to join them. Through trembling words, she confessed that she thought she had made a terrible mistake and asked for forgiveness, calling herself a poor student, a fool. She apologized again and again. As Henry read her letter, he whispered that none of it was true. It was the first time he had ever seen her reveal such vulnerability. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached the part where she wrote that her only wish was to see him. A storm of emotions surged inside him, so strong it made him feel sick, as though his body could no longer contain it. He tried to hold it back, but failed, and the only words that escaped his lips were, "I wish I could see you too." He wanted to protect her, but by the time he fully understood that feeling, it was already too late. That letter was the last one he would ever receive from Martha. Henry wrote back, addressing it "My beloved Martha." He said he was worried for her and reminded her to eat properly. He wasn't sure if it would bring her any comfort, but he pressed the letter against the same tea leaves she had once loved, hoping their scent would cling to the page even in the midst of war. As for him, he continued to train diligently in his dance, writing that once she returned, they would finish the dance they had started at the graduation party, because when that time came, there was something he wanted to tell her. As Henry wrote, the only thought that filled his mind was her return. Again and again, he silently prayed that she would come back safely, until finally, his pen stopped moving. After that, Henry went straight to the post office to send his letter. He thanked the clerk for the assistance, and the man politely replied that it was no trouble at all. As he waited, the noontime broadcast from OBC played over the radio. The announcer reported that the army had successfully broken the enemy's siege on the city of Myth. The 99th Regiment, including the newly established unit of female soldiers, was being commended for its victory, achieved through the noble sacrifice of their lives. Henry froze the moment he heard it. His heart sank, and the world around him seemed to stop. The realization struck him with unbearable weight. Martha was gone, just as the report implied. The scene then shifted back to Eden Academy, where a military official stood before the students to give a patriotic speech. He called them the future of the nation, declaring that during their time in that prestigious school, he hoped each of them would learn to love their country and embrace the spirit to defend it. He went on to say that both young men and women could learn much from the courage of the female soldiers who fought and gave their lives with honor. Suddenly, a voice shouted from the back, telling him to shut up. The students turned in shock. It was Henry. His hair was disheveled, his face drawn and lifeless. He cried out that they should not mythologize them. Another teacher tried to calm him, urging him to sit down, but Henry continued, his voice trembling. He accused them of turning those women's deaths into propaganda. The teacher pleaded with him again to stop, but Henry's voice broke as he shouted that they sacrificed them. Tears filled his eyes as he trembled in fury and despair. They sacrificed their lives, he cried, for this foolish war. The officer's expression hardened. He ordered the soldiers to drag out the traitor immediately. 2 uniformed men seized Henry by the arms and forced him away, silencing him as the horrified students and teachers looked on. While in his cell, the door creaked open and an officer ordered Henry to stand. He had a visitor. Henry, bruised, bloodied, and slumped on the cold floor, slowly lifted his head. His visitor was none other than his father. The older man's face was stern as he looked down at his son. He told him how impressive it was that Henry had managed to disgrace the Henderson name so completely. Henry froze in shock. He hadn't expected to see his father there. His father's tone was cold and final. He told him to think carefully. Either he would change that attitude of his and find a way to get out of that cage, or he would never be allowed to set foot in a classroom again. Left alone with those words, Henry trembled in silence. His mind wrestled with the question, was refusing to bend truly the meaning of strength? Then, he remembered Martha's dream, the one where he was teaching and the students stood around him, hand in hand. He finally found his answer. No, he thought. The future, 10, no, 100 years from now, was worth far more than his fleeting pride. So, Henry swallowed that pride for the sake of what lay ahead. Before long, he was reinstated and returned to teaching at Eden Academy. But this time, his long hair was gone, cut short, as though to mark the weight of everything he had lost. After class, young Desmond approached Henry and remarked that the class had made almost no progress during his time in detention. Henry apologized for that, but Donovan, in his usual blunt tone, said that he was a fool and that one should never rely on those who, in their own foolishness, had once failed him. Henry was caught off guard by those words coming from him. He replied that such a way of thinking was absurd. If people simply gave up on everything and everyone who once failed them, then that would be where the history of humankind ends, and he himself, as a history teacher, would lose all reason to continue his duty. Donovan admitted that he didn't want that to happen. He said that he actually enjoyed Henry's lectures. A faint smile crossed Henry's face as he told him that, in that case, he expected him to study well for tomorrow's lesson. Donovan nodded and agreed. The war, meanwhile, had taken a devastating toll on both sides, and before long, it reached a bitter end. Before long, the streets of Berlin filled with soldiers returning from the front lines. But among them was not the one Henry waited for. He looked for Martha, hoping to see her face again, but his hope was in vain. She never returned. His father later came to visit him, coldly remarking that because of his stubbornness, all his former suitors had already withdrawn. Still, by some miracle, he had managed to arrange a new match for him. He told Henry this was his final chance and that he was in no position to refuse. Henry said nothing in response. With resignation in his heart, he followed his father's command. He met the woman chosen for him, and, soon after, they married. So be it, he thought. Perhaps this is for the best. Far away, somewhere near the border between East and West, a small cottage stood under the dim glow of firelight. Inside, a woman lay weak and bandaged, her body and jaw wrapped in layers of gauze. Her eyes slowly opened. It was Martha. She was alive, but she could not yet speak. Several months before the war's end, moments before Henry would learn that the Women's Combat Battalion had been wiped out, the enemy had already begun advancing toward their position. From there, Martha and her unit could see the enemy tanks closing in as explosions erupted across the battlefield. One shouted for her squad to take cover, but before they could move, a shell landed directly in their area. For a moment, everything went black. Martha couldn't tell if seconds, minutes, or hours had passed. When she finally opened her eyes, smoke filled the air and debris surrounded her. Unsure if she was alive or dreaming, she forced her aching body to move. As she pushed herself up, she realized that being behind an artillery gun must have shielded her from the blast. She touched the battered metal and quietly thanked Black Bell Heavy Industries, for without that piece of machinery, she would have been gone. All around her were bodies, her comrades Jasmine, Linda, and Veronica lay motionless on the ground. The sight tore at her chest. In the distance, several surviving women were seen running as their troops exchanged gunfire with the approaching enemy. Then, one of them was suddenly shot. The shooter, to everyone's horror, was their own captain. The captain ordered them not to abandon their position. Shocked and terrified, the others protested, asking how they were supposed to fight against an entire line of tanks. The captain barked that their mission was to serve as a wall to buy their allies time. If anyone had a problem with that, he said, he'd gladly put them out of their misery right then and there. Tears welled up in their eyes as fear and despair filled the air. From behind, limping and bloodstained, Martha arrived and heard those words. Her voice trembled in anger. She couldn't believe they had come all this way just to be killed by their own commander. Suddenly, someone demanded to know where their artillery support was, as another wave of shells whistled toward them. The next explosion struck their position directly, killing several, including their captain. With command broken, the soldiers turned to the lieutenant for orders, panicking as the battlefield descended into chaos. Some were begging to retreat. Others screamed for a medic to help the wounded. Amid the shouting, the lieutenant finally made the call. They would withdraw. He ordered them to retreat through the woods and toward the fields to the south. The irrigation channels there would slow the tanks down while they waited for the second company to arrive. But as the unit began to move, Martha, struggling to walk, called out desperately for them to wait. A few moments later, Martha stumbled into the woods, searching for everyone. She was exhausted, trembling from the cold and the pain in her feet, and all she could do was sit with her back against a tree and think of her parents and of Henry. While she rested, a gunshot was fired at her, and she realized the enemy had spotted her, thinking she might be one of the Eastern female soldiers. Desperate to survive, she ran with whatever strength she had until she reached a cliff with nowhere left to go. Facing the two pursuers, she opened fire at them. They counterattacked and returned fire, and she took bullets in her shoulder and leg before toppling into the water below. Under the surface, she fought to lift herself, but eventually blacked out and later woke up inside a cottage. The ceiling above her the first thing she saw. Confused, she moved and a dog padded to her feet, which startled her. When she lifted her head, the pain returned, and she realized her wounds had been dressed while she lay on a proper bed. Wondering if she had made it back to Ostania, she saw an old woman watching her. Martha could not speak when the woman peered in. The woman left briefly and, when Martha asked where she was, answered that this was Westalis and addressed her as Miss Ostanian Soldier Girl. Martha was shocked, tried to stand, but the woman told her not to get up. No one would harm her there, and if she had wanted to kill her, she would have already done so. The woman patted her dog and said Martha should be grateful to him. Baron had found her half dead on the riverbank. In Martha's mind, the woman was gruff and always frowning, yet gentle in the way she nursed Martha back to health, even cooking for her until her wounds finally healed. Martha noticed a family photograph once she could stand and force herself to walk, and when she asked the old woman where her clothes were, the woman asked if she meant the army uniform. The woman said she had already thrown away that rag and told Martha to take whatever she wanted from her daughter's things, though Martha remembered seeing a picture of her and felt she could not simply help herself. As the old woman crocheted, she said it was all right. She would not need the uniform anymore because her daughter had died last year and only the right leg had returned home, which made Martha realize the woman's child had been killed in the war. Still, the woman had no cruel words for the Eastern soldier she had sheltered. After changing, Martha followed the woman outside and offered to help now that she could walk, but when the postman arrived, she ducked back inside to hide. The delivery man had a parcel from Mrs. Annabel. He then asked if there was someone else with her that day. Suddenly, the dog barked and he realized it's just Baron. And so he warned her to be careful because there were reports from across the mountains of remnants of Eastern soldiers sneaking into homes to steal food. Mrs. Annabel waved it off, saying it would not go that far, and Martha breathed easier that she had not been noticed. When the delivery man left, Mrs. Annabel came in with a harsher tone, saying the village was full of refugees whose houses had burned and that hatred for Eastern people was spreading across the country. She ordered Martha not to show her face if she did not want to be killed and called her a twit. Martha apologized, but Mrs. Annabel snapped that the country had sent a girl like her to the front lines and that Ostania was pitiful. Martha protested that they had not fought because they wanted to, and that the West should be blamed, that all she wanted was to go home. Mrs. Annabel answered curtly that Martha should leave since staying would put them both in danger, insisted they had never met, and demanded whether Martha understood. Martha answered yes and agreed to go that evening. That night, while Mrs. Annabel slept, Martha quietly sat beside Baron and stroked his fur as he wagged his tail, happy as ever. She whispered her farewell to him, then looked toward the door and softly thanked Mrs. Annabel before stepping outside. Under the cold night sky, she began her journey home. As she walked, the chill bit into her skin. Looking up, she thought the stars over Westalis looked exactly the same as those in the east, and that made sense, she told herself, since they were practically on the same latitude. Using that as her guide, she tried to navigate her way through the dark, circling aimlessly until she realized she had completely lost her sense of direction. Frustration welled up as she cursed how poor her sense of direction was. It was pitch black, and she could barely see where she was going, but she told herself she had to make it back home. Eventually, she decided to rest until dawn, reasoning that she was far enough from the village to be safe. She was determined to survive no matter what. But a few moments later, her stomach growled. She opened her bag to see what was inside and froze. There was enough bread for 2 days, a small pouch of money, and a warm scarf, the very one Mrs. Annabel had been crocheting all week. There was also a folded map with the words "Go Home" written in one corner. Her chest tightened as she stared at it, realizing the kindness the old woman had shown despite everything. Tears filled her eyes, and in her heart she spoke to Henry, thinking how beautiful the Westalis night sky was, how the bread here was delicious, and how kind the people could be. When she finally made it home, she told herself there would be so many stories she wanted to share with him. A map was shown, outlining the route Martha would have to take to get home. The river had carried her far off course, away from the east-west border, so the only way back was through the territory now held by the Western Army, the same front line where she had once fought. Beyond that point lay the Ostanian army's retreat path toward the border. Determined, she set out eastward, though her anxiety grew heavier with every step that brought her closer to the front. The stench of the military filled the air more strongly in every town she passed. Gun smoke, iron, leather, oil, dust, and the faint smell of field kitchen soup. The moment she thought of soup, hunger hit her hard. She was starving, the bread Mrs. Annabel had given her was gone, and she knew she couldn't keep going like that. She needed to buy something to eat with the money Annabel had tucked into her bag. Glancing around, she found a small store and stepped inside. The shopkeeper told her that most of their supplies had already been requisitioned by the army. When he asked if she had a ration card, Martha froze, unable to respond. Panic took over, and she bolted out of the store. The shopkeeper called after her, asking if she was alone and whether she was local, but Martha hastily said she'd just forgotten her ration card at home and would run back to get it. The customers inside exchanged puzzled looks at her behavior. Outside, posters were plastered across the walls warning citizens that looting by Ostanian soldiers had been increasing. Anyone who witnessed such a crime was urged to report it immediately or eliminate the thief on the spot. Reading it, Martha's heart pounded. She became more cautious, her steps lighter, her gaze sharp. With no food to buy and no one she could trust, she had no choice but to keep moving. The memory of being shot by 2 soldiers after they recognized her as an Eastern lady soldier flickered in her mind, making her tremble. She kept scanning her surroundings until she noticed a barn nearby. Peeking inside, she saw a few sheep resting within. There, she took a deep breath and began cutting her hair short. She needed to look like a man, someone less likely to draw suspicion. What she needed most now were men's clothes and information. She quietly apologized in her thoughts to Mrs. Annabel for leaving behind her daughter's clothes. When she stepped outside again, she wondered how she can slip past the Westalis army to return to east. She opened the map Annabel had given her, studying it under the faint morning light. As useful as it was, she knew it didn't show the military positions of the Westalis army. She would have to figure that out on her own. If Ostanian soldiers were scattered throughout the nearby towns, then the front line couldn't be far, or at least, that's what she wanted to believe. From the whispers she'd overheard in town, the Ostanian army was already in the midst of a major retreat. If she didn't reach them soon, she would be left behind entirely. Still, she had to be cautious. There could be landmines anywhere. She traced her finger along the map, trying to choose a safe path. But from above, someone had been watching her. A man's voice called out, noting that if he, thinking she was a man, was carrying that kind of map, he must be holding highly sensitive material. Keeping her voice low, Martha replied that it was given to her by her grandmother. "Is that right?" the man said, warning her to be careful before the military confiscated it. Martha nodded, thanked him briefly, and quickly walked away, unwilling to risk staying any longer. She had to keep moving and find food soon. Her trek continued for hours. Hunger gnawed at her until she could barely stand it, forcing her to pluck wild plants along the roadside, eating whatever looked edible. The cold wind numbed her fingers, and the thought of being spotted by enemy soldiers never left her mind. All she wanted was to return to the people she loved, and that determination was what kept her going. Or so she thought, but she was wrong. What she didn't realize was that her mission had already become meaningless from the start. Her strength finally gave out, and she collapsed onto the ground. As she lay there, weak and trembling, she thought she must be near the front by now, yet she couldn't hear anything. No gunfire, no voices, no marching soldiers. Where was the Eastern Army, she wondered. But at that point, it no longer mattered. Her body could no longer move, and all she could do was let her tears fall silently onto the cold earth. But then she heard a sound, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. Her eyes widened as she realized it was the rumble of an engine. A military vehicle was approaching. When it drew near, the soldiers inside caught sight of her collapsed on the roadside. They slowed down, observing her closely. Martha immediately recognized the uniforms. They were Westala soldiers. Her heart sank. She thought it was over. The soldiers were certain she was Ostanian, and one of them raised his rifle, asking if he should finish him off. Another, however, told him to lower his weapon, saying there was no need. It was over. The war had already ended. Martha couldn't believe what she heard. The war was over, and somehow, she had survived. As the vehicle drove away, she forced her body to move, trembling as she pushed herself upright. The words echoed in her mind. The war was over. A fragile spark of hope flickered inside her, giving her the strength to keep going. But after that, her memory blurred. She could no longer recall what happened next. Only the image of the eastern sky, glowing brighter and brighter, pulling her toward it like a moth drawn to a flame. In the end, she had been crawling on the ground when Ostanian troops assigned to clean up duty near a forward outpost found her barely conscious. They carried her into a military vehicle and brought her with them. Inside, she saw many soldiers, exhausted faces, bandaged arms, eyes that had seen too much. They were survivors like her. She couldn't believe there are so many other soldiers like her who hadn't made it home. One of them recognized her almost immediately, greeting her with surprise. He asked if she was Martha from the women's battalion, saying he'd seen her photo in the papers. The realization stunned her. The man added that he had heard the entire unit was wiped out and said how glad he was that she had made it back alive. Martha couldn't bring herself to respond. The man offered her water and asked if she was all right. She accepted the flask and took a weak sip, her throat dry. He tried to lift her spirits, saying that it was finally over, and all that was left was to go home. From the back, another soldier muttered that they hadn't really won or lost. So what had been the point of all this? What had they even been fighting for? Martha listened silently as the first man replied that they had fought for their homes, and because of all of them, the cities, like Berlin, had survived the war untouched. That, he said, was what truly mattered. That was because of them. Hearing that, Martha managed a faint nod in agreement. In her thoughts, Martha knew this wasn't the kind of ending any of them had hoped for, but she also understood that if none of them could find even the smallest reason to celebrate, their hearts would surely break beyond repair. She thanked the soldier who had given her water, and he introduced himself as Paul, saying he was from Berlin. Surprised, Martha told him she was from Berlin as well, which left him just as astonished. The journey home was long and rough. The truck rattled over uneven roads for hours until they finally crossed the border, where they boarded a train bound for the capital. Martha thought that at last, they were going home alive. The comfort of that realization brought a fleeting warmth to her chest, a fragile sense of peace, but it didn't last long. While on the train, Paul approached her again, offering another flask of water. As she took a sip, he looked at her with a calm smile and asked, almost casually, why they shouldn't just get married once they returned to Berlin. The question shocked her so much that she spat out her drink. Martha quickly told him that she couldn't possibly do that. When he asked if she was already married, she answered softly that she wasn't, but her heart already belonged to someone else. Her face turned pink as she said it. Paul chuckled lightly and told her that all the more reason for her to recover fully and return home safely. As the train rumbled onward, Martha couldn't help noticing how kind he was, not just to her, but to everyone around him. He even passed his canteen to another soldier named Tommy, making sure no one went thirsty. Watching him, Martha wondered quietly what she would say to Henry once she finally made it back. Days turned into weeks as the train continued its journey. With every stop, fewer and fewer passengers remained aboard. And then, at long last, the call came. They had reached Berlin. A cheer erupted through the carriage as soldiers celebrated their return, voices filled with disbelief and relief. Martha's heart swelled. She had truly made it home. She turned to Paul, shaking his shoulder with excitement, urging him to wake up and see that they had arrived. But he didn't move. Her smile faded. She called his name again, this time more softly, fear creeping into her voice. Another soldier nearby glanced over and quietly said that Paul had been cold since last night, that he must not have made it through. Many others hadn't, either. Anyway, they got to get off the train. Martha froze, her throat tightening as tears filled her eyes. That's not fair, she whispered shakily. But there was nothing she could do. The man told her they had to get off the train now. We're back home, the voice said. And so she left Paul's lifeless body behind and stepped out of the carriage. After everything, after all the pain and loss, she had finally returned, alive, but carrying the weight of those who never would. From the train station, Martha began her journey home. She walked along South Berlin Street until finally she reached her house. The moment she opened the door, tears streamed down her face. Her parents froze in disbelief, unable to process the sight before them, their daughter alive. The longing and sorrow in their eyes melted into relief as the three of them rushed into each other's arms, crying uncontrollably. It was a miracle that their family was whole again. That night, her parents prepared a feast of warm dishes, and they ate together in quiet joy. Her mother stayed by her side afterward, watching over her as she fell asleep, afraid to take her eyes off her for even a moment. The next morning, Martha awoke early and dressed neatly to go out. Her mother, noticing, asked where she was headed, and Martha answered that she was going to the school. Her mother tried to stop her, but Martha didn't listen. She went straight to Eden Academy. When she arrived and asked for Henry, one of the staff told her it was the weekend, meaning teachers who lived off campus weren't around. Shocked, she hadn't even realized it was the weekend already. Just then, another teacher approached her and, upon seeing her face, gasped in recognition. It was Mr. Fowler. He asked in disbelief if she truly was Miss Marriott. When she nodded, his expression softened into joy. He said it warmed his heart to see her home safely. News about the women's battalion had spread everywhere, and he admitted he feared the attention it might bring her in the coming days. If there was anything he could do to help, he said, she only had to ask. Martha didn't hesitate. She explained that she wanted to know where Mr. Henderson lived. Fowler took out a small notepad, drew her a quick map, and marked the location of Henry's new address, explaining that he had just moved recently. She thanked him deeply and wasted no time leaving. As she followed the directions, her heart began to race faster with every step. Excitement and nerves mixed within her chest as she thought of seeing him again. The closer she got, the quicker she walked, until she could hardly contain the emotion rising in her throat. She closed her eyes briefly to calm herself, but in her haste, she tripped and fell hard onto the ground. Flustered and embarrassed, she sat up, brushing the dirt off her clothes as tears welled in her eyes. Just then, someone approached and asked if she was all right. She managed a small smile and thanked him, insisting she was fine. But when she looked up, her breath caught, because the man helping her up was Henry himself. Her eyes widened, and emotion overwhelmed her as tears began to fall freely. She uttered his name softly, voice trembling. Henry froze, stunned, staring at her face as if he were seeing a ghost. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, In disbelief, he whispered her name back, asking if it was really her. His voice broke as he admitted that all this time, he had thought she was dead. Martha immediately stood and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly as tears burst forth uncontrollably. At long last, after everything she had endured, she had finally found him again. She sobbed against his chest, repeating his name over and over, her voice breaking between gasps of relief and disbelief. She told him how deeply she had missed him, how she had longed for this reunion every single day. Henry, still frozen in shock, could barely process what was happening. It didn't feel real. Martha, alive, standing before him. But as the realization sank in, emotion overtook him. He returned her embrace, clutching her tightly as his own tears fell. She had survived. Against all odds, she had come back. Neither of them cared that people were staring. They wept openly in the middle of the street, their emotions raw, their hearts overflowing, after months of separation. Martha's words breaking between sobs as she tried to tell him how long she had waited for this moment. Henry could only hold her closer. But their moment shattered when a woman's voice called out from nearby, asking Henry who that was. Startled, they both loosened their embrace and turned toward the voice. Martha blinked through her tears, still trembling, as Henry awkwardly stepped back. He replied that this was one of his students, someone who had just returned from the war. The woman smiled kindly and thanked Martha for her service. Then, with a warm tone, she suggested that perhaps they should invite her to dinner. Martha, still trying to compose herself, glanced between them in confusion and asked who she was. Henry froze, struggling for words. Finally, he answered quietly. She was his wife. The world seemed to stop. Martha's breath caught, and her tears suddenly went still. She could only stare at him, unable to process the words. Henry continued, explaining that they had only been married a month ago. His tone was calm, almost apologetic, but it only made the moment heavier. Martha twinged. She doesn't know how to react. The woman bowed politely and said with a soft smile that her name was Lucia. Lucia Henderson, Henry's wife. At that instant, something inside Martha broke. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, the sound drowning out the world around her. Memories flooded her mind. Their days at Eden Academy, their tea parties, their exchanged letters, the promises she held on to during the war, the dream of seeing him again. Every moment replayed in her mind like fragments of a life she could no longer claim. And just like that, it all slipped away. The future she had fought so desperately to reach, the one thing that had kept her alive, was gone. She could barely form words, but finally managed to whisper, "Is that so? Congratulations." Even she could remember how her voice trembled as those words left her lips, fragile and hollow. Because the truth was, the pain that pierced through her heart at that moment was far worse than anything she had suffered in the battlefield. She just couldn't accept it. She cursed their era, and she cursed herself. That night, when she returned home, Martha wept until her tears could no longer fall, mourning not just Henry, but the last piece of her adolescence had finally come to an end. Back in the present, Becky was sobbing uncontrollably after hearing Martha's story. She couldn't accept that everything had ended that way. She stood up in disbelief, shaking her head in frustration. "No," she cried, "it can't just end like that." Her voice broke as she shouted in anger, unable to contain the emotions that surged inside her. Martha, however, remained calm and gently told her to settle down and control herself. Becky, still trembling, demanded to know why Martha hadn't fought for the man, not knowing it was Henry. Why didn't she steal him back? She asked desperately. But Martha answered that home wrecking was a strict no. Becky protested immediately, saying she couldn't possibly accept the woman he married. Martha, however, quietly explained that the man's wife was, in truth, a wonderful person. Her uncle was a distinguished man who had played a significant role in supporting the nation's post-war reconstruction. Through the efforts of his niece and her new husband, Martha was eventually given the opportunity to dance again, performing ballet at one of their charity events. She admitted that she hadn't been thrilled about being introduced to the audience as a survivor of the Women's Combat Unit, nor was she entirely satisfied with her own performance, limited by the lingering pain from her injuries. But despite all of that, she was able to dance again, on a stage she had long dreamed of standing upon. And when the crowd erupted into warm applause, Martha said she would never forget how it felt. In that moment, it was as if she was dancing once more in a world where the Marlov Ballet still existed, and she had been able to join it. On that stage, she finally remembered what it meant to be truly alive. She couldn't stop crying after the performance, not out of sorrow, but from the overwhelming sense of release. She was finally able to grasp that she had an entire life ahead of her. Henry's wife had been there too, watching her from the audience, clapping with genuine joy. She looked so happy for Martha, as if she herself were the one performing. And though her heart still ached, Martha said she was grateful that she could make her feel that kind of happiness. As for Henry, Martha said that he had loved his wife deeply, as any good husband should. And rather than resentment, she felt pride, because the man she had once loved so dearly had remained a kind and faithful man. Or at least, she said softly, a faint smile forming on her lips. That's how she was able to feel about it after all these years. But Becky still couldn't accept it. She mentioned that if there had never been a war, Martha could have achieved her dreams. She could have had everything she fought for, and the love between her and that man might have been fulfilled. If all those arrogant elites wanted war so badly, then they should have fought it themselves, she said. They shouldn't have dragged innocent people into it. Martha, however, spoke gently, her tone calm but heavy with experience. She told Becky that the world wasn't that simple. It was full of countless things, interconnected, tangled, and far too complex to easily understand. But Becky refused to let it go. She glared at Martha and demanded, "What kind of things?" Martha looked at her and asked back, "What do you think?" Becky frowned in frustration. If she knew, she snapped, she wouldn't be asking her. Martha sighed softly and admitted that she didn't know for sure either. That only irritated Becky more. What did she mean? She asked, telling her not to be vague with her and to say it clearly. With a faint, sad smile, Martha tried to explain. She said that it's often the things we don't understand that make us uneasy. She believed it came from something instinctive, buried deep within everyone, an animal instinct that drives us to seek comfort in certainty. That's why people convince themselves they understand what they don't, just to feel at ease or to make themselves feel better. They tell themselves that the people of that country are just plain evil, or that it's the elites doing whatever they please again. And maybe it really is that simple, or maybe it isn't. But clinging to those kinds of beliefs and convincing themselves their absolute truth is a kind of weakness, and a dangerous one. Accepting that you don't know, she said quietly, is just as important as striving to learn the truth. Becky stared at her in silence, overwhelmed by the depth of what she'd just said. Then, Martha added that she even fought in the Second War between the East and West. And after all of that, she still don't understand anything at all. Just that battlefields are tragic and miserable places. That was the only truth she knew for sure. Becky was in disbelief that she went back, after almost dying the first time. She wondered why she would do that. Martha mentioned that the man was angry too and said the same thing. She admitted she was quite conflicted about it herself. Becky, still frustrated, told Martha to stop being so mysterious and just say who the man was. She pressed her insistently, asking who he really was. If he had taught at Eden, was he still there even now? Did she know him? Martha froze at the question, startled by how close Becky had come to uncovering the truth. For a brief second, she almost uttered the name Mr. Henderson, but she silenced her. She smiled faintly and said that prying into others' affairs was rude. Then, placing a finger to her lips, she gestured for Becky to stay quiet. Everyone, she added, had things they wished to keep secret. Wasn't that true for all people? She turned away and walked off, laughing softly as she told Becky to simply accept that she didn't know. Becky frowned, clearly dissatisfied, and called after her, demanding to know where she was going. Martha only replied that she had somewhere to be. Later that day, she walked through the quiet paths of a cemetery, a bouquet of flowers in her hands. Suddenly, a voice called her name. It was Henry. She turned, surprised to see him there. He welcomed her, remarking that she'd come again this year, and with flowers, just like always. He thanked her for it, but she explained that she brought them because she found comfort in the gesture. She couldn't believe 15 years had already passed. Time really did fly. With all their wrinkles, it has certainly left its mark on them. The passage of time was indeed cruel, and yet, some things never changed, like how terrible of a dancer he still was. Henry looked at her, utterly taken aback. He insisted that he thought he'd improved since then, though he admitted that she was still just as cheeky as ever. The two of them laughed together. Henry then said that the weather was beautiful that day, perfect for tea. He invited her to join him. Martha nodded. "If it's not too bitter," she said, "then she'll gladly have a cup."